So, hello everyone. Welcome back after the Christmas holiday break. Today I will be coming back with in-person guest. So I'm very happy to present you Dr. Mandi Astola, right? Okay. I'm not sure, like it was 50-50. She is an assistant professor at Delft University of Technology, and she's a philosopher interested in virtue theory, moral theory of collective action, and ethics of innovation. She also aims to make philosophy public and accessible to everyone, like by, for example, translating academic work to non-academic audiences. And today she'll be talking about bullshit promises in the corporate context, I believe. So, Mandy, over to you. Thank you very much for joining.
Yeah, it's really great to be here. Very nice also to be physically in Bristol and to make a little UK trip out of it. Let me share my screen. There we go. Share. Okay. Okay, I guess you can all see my screen now, right?
Except it's black.
It's supposed to be black.
Is this the right window, or do you want the?
Oh no, it's the other one. Should be there.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh yeah, wonderful. Okay, good. Thank you. So when the screen is black, you're supposed to be looking at me. That's the idea. Yeah. Yeah. So thanks a lot for being here. So my name is Mandi, and I'll say a little bit about myself before I start the talk. I work indeed at Delft University of Technology, which is right here, very close to The Hague and Rotterdam, where I live. And I'm a philosopher, and I work on two topics. I work on moral philosophy, so what is right and what is wrong, what's good and what's bad, and also epistemology. So what is knowledge, what is truth, and what is also untruth. And I am the kind of philosopher who thinks that both of these questions are best answered by looking at the inquirer or the moral agent themselves. So I'm a philosopher who thinks that psychology is actually very important to answering these fundamental questions, and not just some, conceptual analysis about justified true belief. Or
that's why we invited you.
Yeah. Wonderful. So, and about the topic of today a little bit, and also my reasons for talking about this topic. I'm quite concerned about the future. I'm very concerned about climate change and whether we're going to manage to solve it. And at my work at TU Delft, we have engineering students, and I teach them ethics. So I teach these engineers to use words like values and virtues, and also stuff like responsible innovation and how you can carry out technological innovation responsibly. So I teach them all these terms, right? And I teach them all this stuff. And in the end, I know that many of my students are going to end up working for lots of corporations. For example, Shell. A lot of TU Delft graduates go to work at Shell. And I know that Shell puts out, it's an oil company, and they put out a lot of this kind of stuff. Like, yeah, we only engage in responsible energy. We respect nature. These are our company values, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes this gives me a bit of an existential crisis, because I wonder, what am I teaching these kids? And where is the ethical terminology that I teach them going to end up? Are they using it to bullshit? Am I teaching these kids to bullshit, to greenwash, right? So that's why I got interested in the topic of bullshitting to begin with. And in this talk, I'm going to basically make three claims. I'm going to talk about three things. The first is, what are bullshit promises? And the second, how do bullshit promises relate to promises to try? And I'm going to zoom in a little bit on the corporate context. And then thirdly, I'm going to talk about some of the positive sides of bullshit and some of the reasons why we maybe actually should be a little bit tolerant of corporate bullshit. I'm realizing that I don't have a timer running, so I'm just quickly going to set one so I don't go too far over time. Okay. So first of all, what is bullshit? Let's start with that. So some of you might know this little essay from Harry Frankfurt, who's a philosopher, on bullshit. So the idea is that bullshit is somewhere in between telling the truth and lying. So it's not quite a lie, it's not quite telling the truth, but it's when you speak with a certain disregard for the truth. There's also another definition of bullshit, which is from Cohen. And this is actually, he's considering a very different type of bullshit. So he's in particular concerned with like French philosophers and like continental philosophers. He doesn't really like this kind of philosophy. So he says, these are cases where people actually are sincere about what they're saying, but it's so unclarifiable that it doesn't mean anything to anyone. So it's unclarifiable unclarity. But this is a very different species of bullshit than the Frankfurt definition. Yeah, I like it too. And I'm mostly using the Frankfurt definition though. So if we look at what is Frankfurt style bullshit, the truth teller and the liar are kind of playing the same game. So let's imagine that the truth teller and the liar are like playing tennis, you know? The truth teller wants to communicate the truth. The liar also cares about the truth, but they're trying to hide the truth. If they're like playing tennis, then the bullshitter is dancing around with a tennis racket in their hand. So it looks like they're playing, but they're not playing. And that's why it's so hard to beat a bullshitter in a debate, because they're not playing the same game as you. So then the next question is, when is bullshitting bad? There is this book by Kasim Kassam about vices of the mind. And what he says in this book is that bullshit tends to be the primary product of epistemic insouciance. And epistemic insouciance is an attitude. It is an attitude of nonchalance towards truth. And so what Kassam says is this is a bad attitude to have. It's like a bad thing if you are uncaring about the truth, if you have that kind of attitude. And so he's mostly talking about like post-truth politics and stuff like that, and how this is what makes bullshitting bad. It's the fact that it shows that you have this attitude. And in Kassam's work, it's also very clear that it's not bad to bullshit occasionally, but if it's clear that you have this attitude and you're constantly bullshitting because of it, then that's really bad. So if we sort of try to model what Kassam is saying in a nice little picture, we can say the bullshitter speaks something out, right? So they say a proposition, they utter a proposition. This proposition has a truth value, and the speaker does not care about the truth value of the proposition. This is an instance of epistemic insouciance. That's kind of what it looks like. And an example, of course, is Trump. And this is Trump answering a question about busing, which he didn't really know what it meant. So he just starts talking about getting people to schools. There's also this example, right? There's this very famous post-truth interview with Michael Gove, where he says kind of, yeah, we send 20 billion gross a year to the European Union every year. And when he was pressed about the fact that experts disagree with him, he said, the people of this country have had enough of experts or something, right? So this is also a clear example of bullshit. But this doesn't only happen in the political context. It also happens with corporations. So if you look at Meta, for example, what used to be Facebook, their mission statement is, they say that their mission is to give people the power to build community and bring the world closer together. If Facebook is an advertising company, so this kind of seems a bit weird. And I think this mission statement was actually there before the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which is, which makes it very hard to believe that they are sincere about this. And another example is Saudi Aramco. So this is an oil company that I think is responsible for 4% of the world's carbon emissions, like one single company. And they say that their manifesto is that we energize the ideas that make our resources more dependable, more sustainable, and more useful. And yeah, this also sounds a bit bullshitty, as in your bullshit detector tends to go off. And they also say very clearly on their website, we support the aims of the Paris Agreement to limit the global average below 2%, before 2 degrees, sorry. And of course, they're not doing anything. They are like doing very, very little to change their business model or to do anything for sustainability. So here you also kind of think, well, sure, you support, but do you really? And then there's this statement. This is from Shell, so from the Dutch and UK company. Shell's target is to become net zero emissions energy business by 2050. Now, this one in particular is interesting because it seems to be a promise. So there is the word promise isn't in that sentence. They're not saying we promise to become net zero. But I found a bunch of articles online that interpreted this statement as a promise. So even if it doesn't literally have the word vow or promise in it, I think you could easily make the case that it is a kind of promise because everybody seemed to interpret it that way. And, you know, given that language is contextual and stuff like that, I think this kind of counts as a promise. So it's a promise. It's not an assertion. It's not an assertion about the state of affairs in the world. And that's a different type of speech act than the kind of bullshit from Trump that I was showing you before. So the statement, for example, from Michael Gove, right? The statement about the UK sending 20 or 30 billion to the EU every year, that's an assertive. So it's a statement about the state of affairs in the world. Whereas the example that I just showed you from Shell is a commissive. So it's a promise to do something in the future. It's an instance of making the world fit your words rather than making your words fit the world. So that means that it doesn't really look like this. So, because when you make a promise, it's not a proposition and it doesn't have a truth value. So talking about it in terms of like epistemic insouciance can't be right. So I've tried to come up with a different way to describe what actually is going wrong there. What is a bullshit promise and what makes it bad? What is the underlying negative attitude that makes bullshitting bad in the case of bullshit promises? So when a bullshitter makes a bullshit promise, I think that for every promise, you have certain conditions. These are like felicity conditions. I'm taking these from the philosopher Searle. So let's just go through these conditions really quickly. I don't know if people are familiar with these. But first of all, there's the preparatory condition. So when you are making a promise, it's important that you are actually able to perform the promise. So, for example, I cannot promise to you that Katy Perry and Lady Gaga are going to get married tomorrow because this is not in my power to promise. And secondly, it's also important that when you make a promise that you actually believe that the other person wants you to do it. So I'm not going to promise you something that I don't think you want me to do. And it also has to be obvious that I wouldn't perform that action anyway. So if I promise to all of you right now that I will leave this room at some point, I think it's pretty clear that I probably would anyway at some point. So it just doesn't really count as a promise. Also, there's a sincerity condition. So it's important that if I make a promise that I'm actually intending to do it. Is there a question in there?
Yes, Lord.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. It's just, could a threat be conceived as a promise? Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's good for the person that you're talking to. Like, you could promise to do something bad to them if they did something to you, or like you just promising to do something bad. It doesn't necessarily have to be a good
Yeah,
Like,
in that case, you wouldn't have the second condition, right? Like you probably
Second
doesn't
condition
want,
would be that.
doesn't want.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's interesting. I haven't thought of that actually. Like, can a threat be a promise? Yeah, I guess not. I guess then it's a threat. I guess it's also commissive. You could say it's also kind of commissive. Maybe we need a new category in in the speech act theory. That's interesting. I haven't thought about that. Yeah, right. But in general, for promises, or at least Searle seems to think that it's important that, that the speaker actually wants the thing to happen. So yeah. And then there's also the propositional content. So that just means that it predicates a future act. So you cannot promise something that's already in the past. You can say that, but then it's not really a promise in a proper form. And then there's also, and this one is, I think, very important too, the essential condition, which is that what you are saying actually counts as you promising it. And I think the best way to explain this condition is to say, you are not an actor in a play right now. So if I make a promise, but we are engaging in a play or a game or make-believe, then you know that it doesn't count as a promise. So then we wouldn't fulfill the essential condition. And I think that cases where you are joking, so when you're like kidding around or just making a joke or something, this also means that you don't fulfill the essential condition. Right. So now what do I think about bullshit promises? I think that in the case of a bullshit promise, the speaker does not care about whether they meet these conditions. So instead of not caring about the truth of a proposition, you're uncaring about whether you meet these things. So that's what I think about bullshit promises. And an example that I use in a paper that I have under review right now is the drunkard boyfriend. So if you have a boyfriend that is constantly getting drunk and stealing your stuff, and then you come home and for so many a time they've taken stuff from you and they're just in an awful state, and they say like, and you threaten to break up with them, and they're like, I promise I'll be better. There's many ways in which you might think like, well, the drunkard boyfriend clearly does not care about whether they meet these conditions. So for example, you're not sure whether they're serious. They might be kind of like joking, or they might be engaging in some kind of, they might mean it more as like a poetic romantic thing to say rather than a real promise. Or you might also doubt their sincerity, right? Like there's a lot of things you would doubt here. And for me, in the case of Shell, when Shell says that their target is to become zero energy by 2050, this is a lot like the drunkard boyfriend. The structure of this problem is a lot like the drunkard boyfriend. And you might also have doubts about various of these conditions. So for example, you might wonder if the essential condition is met, because you think like, well, a company is allowed to advertise, right? So if they make this kind of statement that it's kind of like, sort of in an advertising context, then it doesn't really seem to fulfill the essential condition, because a lot of, advertising is essentially a bullshitting contest. And you might also doubt their sincerity, and you might also doubt the preparatory conditions, whether they're actually able to perform this action. Right. So while in the case of bullshit assertions, they are insouciant about the truth value of a proposition, and in bullshit promises, you're insouciant about whether you meet the sincerity conditions. Like Kassam said, in the case of bullshit assertions, we have epistemic insouciance, an attitude of disregard towards truth and knowledge and inquiry. I think that in the case of bullshit promises, we have trust insouciance. And that is what makes it morally wrong, that you are treating way too lightly the trust of the public when you make statements like this, or when Shell makes statements that are, or makes promises that are bullshitty. So that's my take on bullshit promises. Now, I'll say something about bullshit promises and promises to try, because this is a very connected phenomenon. So if we take this, for example, another quote from Shell: "We are committed to meeting the world's growing energy demand responsibly and sustainably." If you look at this sentence, it looks to me a lot like a promise to try, because you're not really saying like, we are actually going to do this thing. Like, we've just hired a corporate sustainability officer, or we've decided to sort of close a couple of factories and start some, sun energy factories instead. But you're just saying we're really committed about this thing. We're really committed towards this thing. So it's kind of a promise to try. And of course, there's a lot of philosophical discussion about whether promises to try actually count as like legitimate promises. And so there's one paper by Marusik who argues that when your partner, so when like a lover says to another lover, "I promise to try to remain faithful to you," then this isn't really very reassuring, because it sounds like they are definitely not going to be faithful to you if they say this, right? So that, the sort of intuitive unappeal of this sentence already makes clear that there seems to be something wrong with it. And the explanation that is given in this paper is that a promise to try often hides a possible choice, so the choice to cheat, under the veil of susceptibility to circumstances beyond our control. So there is no way that you can check whether somebody has actually carried out a promise to try. And that's why it's very easy to hide your choices under, well, I really tried, but then I decided not to, So that's one reason why you might be skeptical about promises to try. But of course, in some cases, you can only promise to try, because some things are just really, really difficult to deal with. Like in this picture, you have this huge monster. And if you're gonna, like, you might not want to promise someone that you're gonna defeat this monster, but you might promise that you'll try. And De Cruz and Khalif actually argue in another article that in many cases, it's way more appropriate to promise to try, because sometimes promising to do something is just overly ambitious, especially in cases where you are promising against the evidence. So you're promising to do something that is very unlikely. And it's actually in these cases more respectful of the trust of the promisee.
And so what is the distinction between the two? Is it the capability that you have? So in other words, the first one, I'll promise to try to be faithful.
Yeah.
Okay. You sort of look at this, you figure, oh, okay, well, good luck to you. But this one is different. So what is it? Is it the capability of the person who's making the promise? Is that the distinction? Is that the one?
Yeah, I mean, you could say the capability, or you could say it's the difficulty of the challenge, difficulty of the thing that you're trying to promise, right?
But if it is very difficult for that guy to be faithful, then is that an acceptable promise to try? Yeah.
So that's another question. It's like whether, so I guess that's like the whole question. Should you make promises to try? Because there's something to be said for, like, if it is so difficult for you to be faithful, maybe you should just not make any promise at all. Like, why would you make a promise to try? But of course,
but in this case,
if you say, like, I promise I will try to defeat this monster to protect you or whatever, like, you can imagine that somebody really will promise to try.
That's a good thing.
Yeah, that's a good thing. And some cases it seems appropriate, and in some cases, like, in the case of the person who wants to cheat and wants to also make a promise, it seems a bit it can seem a bit inappropriate. And I think the distinguishing thing between these two cases is that in the case where promises to try are legit, it requires a lot of trust and trustworthiness to replace kind of the need for verification. So, if your employer says like, I promise to try to keep your job until next year, then, this might be a bullshit promise. But like, if it's like a really good friend or something like that, or your partner or somebody you really, really trust, and they say, I promise to try, then you might actually take it seriously. It might actually be a legitimate promise. Like,
I think Costas had a hand up.
Yes.
I don't know if that's going
Oh,
down
yeah.
again.
Yeah, I can keep it for later. I don't want to interrupt. So
okay, but do
I
save
will
it.
have
Do
time.
save it until
Yeah.
later. Then remember it. Okay, so I think the promises to try are legit if the promiser and the promisee really trust each other. And I feel like there's something still here that I need to clarify or to figure out exactly. But this is the farthest I've come so far with this particular question. Right. So if we take that, you need trust in order to make promises to try. You can imagine that in the case of, so I'm just going to try and connect this to bullshit promises again a little bit. If you've got two friends and they really, really trust each other, they have a very deep bond of trust. One of them says, I promise to try. Then the other knows that they care about whether they meet the felicity conditions. They've had to think like, am I able to try? Am I able to, do they want me to do this? And am I sincere about this? And are we for real right now? They are conscious of these things while they are making that promise. Whereas if you do not have this bond of trust, then it's very easy for the promisee to see this as a bullshit promise. And, in many cases, I think it also is. We can also imagine that the promisor is really good and they're really serious and they really care about this promise to try, but they are still not trusted. I think in that case, it's okay to make a promise to try, and it's just too bad that your audience doesn't trust you. But even in that case, you could say that a promise to try is a bit inappropriate. And like Marusik argues in this article that I cited earlier, promises to try can also place an unfair burden on the promisee. Because let's say that you say, I promise I'll try to come to your party. Then the promisee might actually, make some extra food ready in case you come. And also it might be much better to give a conditional promise rather than a promise to try. So to make it a bit more specific and say something like, I promise to do it unless so-and-so happens. Like, I promise to be faithful unless, unless you decide to, I don't know, move to another country for 3 years or something like that. That might be a more suitable promise or a more reassuring promise. And of course, the question is, can Shell and the public have this kind of very trusting relationship that enables promises to try? Or is the relationship not like that? So I don't think that the public and Shell have this kind of relationship. So just based on that, I think I would conclude that it isn't really appropriate for Shell to be making promises to try, if you look at it this way. Right, so that's promises to try. Just gonna check how much time I still have left. Yeah.
I have a
So,
question.
yes, Luke, go ahead.
Quickly before we move on, is the trust in the other person context dependent? So like with Shell and the public, if Shell promised, we'll make sure that there's petrol at the petrol station whenever you go there to fill up your car, I would trust them that that is the case because, well, there always is petrol at the Shell petrol stations. If they say we're going to end climate change, I don't trust them. So it's potentially context dependent trust.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah, I think it's definitely context dependent. And I think an important part of the fact that part of the distrust that we have towards Shell is the fact that they are like a commercial party, and we know that they are interested in making money off of oil because that's what they do, that's what their business model is based on. So we have no reason to think that they have an incentive to do something about climate change. They actually have incentives to not do anything about climate change. So I think you're right about that. I think it's definitely sort of, yeah, a context dependent thing.
But I think that also like links back to the conditions in serve. Like that would be like your example to say, oh, I promise to leave the room at the end of the meeting. Like it would be probably the same thing. Yeah, I expect you to do that. So it's not really a promise. No?
Oh, right. Yeah.
So like I expect Shell to put oil in your station because that's what they do. So I wouldn't take that as
yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. I mean that's actually a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. No, I would agree so. And I think also that in terms of if Shell would promise, we promise to do something about climate change, I think because of their business model, you might also wonder if the preparatory conditions are met. Like, are they able, is it possible for Shell to do something like this?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So now we've talked a lot about the negative sides of bullshitting. Now here's something positive. Reasons to be tolerant. So I noticed I was looking for examples of corporate bullshit and business bullshit, and I came across a few papers in like organizational psychology and stuff like that. One of them is this one, Confronting Indifference Towards Truth, Dealing with Workplace Bullshit. These authors have like a really nice 4-step framework for how to deal with workplace bullshit, or how people in general deal with workplace bullshit. First part is to comprehend, then to recognize, and then to act, which includes either escaping the bullshit, confronting the bullshit, being loyal and accepting the bullshit, or just neglecting, like disengaging from the bullshit. And then there's also some steps on how to prevent bullshitting. And an important one on there is like, you have to value expertise over egalitarianism and evidence over opinions, encourage critical thinking, and so on. So these are ways that you can prevent bullshitting in your organization. There's also another paper I found that was about actually sort of corporate social responsibility bullshit, which I found great because this is something I hate so much. And this was in a context of banks. And there was a nice table with lots of examples of different types of bullshit, like bullshit company slogans was one, and then there was bullshit statements and marketing bullshit, and also like jargon bullshit, which is kind of, you know, when people use these cringy office terms like blue sky thinking or whatever, right? Yeah. And so I also found this paper, which was about, which was kind of making like an organizational bullshit perception scale. And they had lots of items on the scale. And it turned out that people can recognize bullshitting, like that there were kind of 3 main types of bullshitting that people tended to recognize inside their organization. I think one had to do with just having a regard for truth. Another type of bullshit was bullshitting about the boss, so what the boss was doing, and trying to make it sound like you were in line with what the boss was doing, or you were positive about it. And then there was a big category of bullshit language, so that was all the abbreviations and like thought shower, blue sky thinking, that kind of stuff. And all of this stuff is very much aimed at how do we eliminate bullshit, how do we sort of call it out when it happens. But I think in many cases, bullshit is also positive. Like in the paper, Frankfurt talks about like having a bull session at the bar. I think a lot of our sort of friendly social talk revolves around bullshitting, and you cannot always insist on the truth. I think Wittgenstein famously did, but he didn't really have that many friends, except like, I don't know, Elizabeth Anscombe or whatever. But yeah, I think it's a part of our social bonding to bullshit a little bit. And another point is also development and also learning. That involves a lot of bullshitting. So children copy what adults do, and they do this in order to learn. And also, you know, students copy what teachers do, right? And students sometimes say stuff that their teachers say. And I think as a PhD student, I was also just sometimes saying stuff that I heard my supervisor saying. And I think that's how you learn to become an expert, right? You pretend you're an expert, and then at some point you are one. So bullshitting is also really a part of our development and a part of our learning as human beings. And there's this nice quote, creativity is intelligence having fun. And if we are too insistent on cutting down bullshit, we're going to lose all creativity. Because creativity, being creative, involves a lot of bullshitting. You cannot insist that everything you say or think is true all the time, because this is a real buzzkill. And then there's, of course, also stuff like this. So I'm pretty sure that whoever made this picture is not really concerned about like the truth value of this proposition. It's more just about motivating people and inspiring people, right? So we use language for a lot more purposes than just communicating the truth.
Surely that's Photoshop.
Oh, let's see. Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay, he's very buff.
Bullshit.
Yeah. Yeah. Or he's using a lot of steroids. I don't know. Lovely gentleman. So there's positive bullshit, which helps us to bond socially. And then there's motivational bullshit, which is insouciant of the truth, but very much caring about your state of mind, your motivation, and also some future state of affairs that you're aspiring towards. And so I found this paper actually about organizational bullshit from Christensen et al. And in that paper, they claimed that one of the areas where you see a lot of bullshit is in strategizing. So when you're trying to, for example, if a company is trying to create a new strategy, you need to like envision some future state of affairs that doesn't exist yet. And at the same time, you also kind of have to like instill confidence in people, because otherwise nothing is going to happen if you don't motivate people to do something, even if the outcome is very uncertain. Then there's also something that I call norm enforcement bullshit. So so if you want to change a norm, you can tell people that norm is already in place. That's what I've understood from some of the psychological research that I've read. So if you say something like, we really care about the environment, like our company is super sustainable and we care, then you might actually be motivating people to care, because you are telling them that the norm is to care about the environment. So then they might feel more inclined to actually care about the environment. And then I also found a lot of work in psychology saying that when you repeat things to people, they start to believe it. I know that this was the case with factual statements. Now, I'm not entirely sure if this is the case also with value statements. But if you keep telling people sustainability is important, they might start to believe it. And you could say this is kind of like evil brainwashing, but at the same time, you are also helping enforce a norm that we all kind of on a second order level think is important, but we just have like first order trouble accepting sometimes in our daily life. And another one also from this paper is that a lot of bullshit in organizations comes from commanding while trying to save face. So because we like flat hierarchies and stuff like that, it's sometimes very awkward for bosses to command the people that work for them. So what people will say is like, oh, it would be really good for your personal development if you did this task. And people find like roundabout ways of commanding others to do things because they don't want to sound like they're commanding. And now the authors of this paper, they really condemn that kind of practice. They said like, yeah, this is bad because you're kind of shoving the hierarchy under the carpet and it's actually disempowering to people. And I completely understand that point. But at the same time, I think it's kind of good that we uphold that norm of it's not okay to command people. Like it's a kind of egalitarian norm that we try to hold up, even in a situation where we live in a very hierarchical society and we have an organizational hierarchy. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to still try to uphold that kind of norm of politeness. I think that's actually, there's something very positive about that as well. Because imagine if we didn't do it and we would just get used to like commanding each other. If your boss would just like flat out command you to do something, yeah, that might not be good because that might normalize that kind of thing also outside of your work life. Yeah, so that's, I think norm enforcement bullshit can be okay sometimes.
There's also another question from Luke.
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add into that. I'm not sure if I agree because if you sweep the norm enforcements of social hierarchy under the carpet, it means it's much more difficult to confront power structures when they become more tyrannical or too strong and commanding, especially if they're using that sort of language, which means that it's easier to manipulate people. It makes it more difficult in order to see when it's occurring, and therefore people won't change the power structures in place, so it doesn't promote egalitarian values. I don't know.
Yeah, so I think I completely get that point. And I think the authors of the article, they were really 100% with you on this one. So they were also really like, yeah, this is a bad thing. Like bosses should just command people that work for them because then it's clearer that there is a power hierarchy. Like we shouldn't try to kind of sweep it under the carpet. And I mean, I guess my worry is just like, if we normalize that kind of thing, if we normalize that kind of behavior, are they going to go home and like, I don't know, command their partner and children as well? Are they going to try and command people on the bus because they think that they have like a higher status or whatever? Is this not going to like erode the kind of like egalitarian norms that we have? Like that would be the thing that I worry about, but I completely see your worry as well. And I don't really know which one is more important.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to like just put it out there and have a little discussion about that because it was just something that...
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I completely see where you're saying that.
Dawn also has a question?
Yeah, it's related to what Luke said, and I wanted to thank Luke for challenging that a bit because I also think that sometimes it's context, and I wonder, are we being a bit, well, are we not giving people the benefit of the doubt if they that they can't switch between, okay, this is a situation where you need to give a command because the task needs to get done and the person can't say no because it's essential, versus, okay, this is actually something where it would be good for the person, but then it's their responsibility to say yes or no. So I think what I'm worried about is situations where, for example, it has to be done because, I don't know, work objectives or whatever, but it's framed as though, oh, well, it's good for you, so you've got to do it. You have to choose to do it as well. So it's not almost like you have to do it, but you also have to like doing it. And that feels a bit controlling in terms of for emotions.
Yeah, okay. So if I understood correctly what you're saying that in a case of like commanding someone to do it, it doesn't require the other person to respond with bullshit as well. Because of course, if your boss commands you in a sort of bullshitty way, then you also have to bullshit yourself in order to respond to it, which is even more manipulative maybe, because you also have to pretend that you like it and stuff like that. It makes it really hard for you to challenge the power hierarchy. Or yeah, is that roughly what you're saying, Dawn?
Yeah, you've put it more succinctly than me.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah. I mean, okay. I'm hearing a lot of pushback on that particular point. Like, I see how it is problematic. And I think, yeah, I think I'm going to have to make a better case for that one. Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. That's definitely a good point.
I do think an interesting place to study it would be a lot of East Asian societies where the hierarchy is so embedded, but then the sort of command is implicit. And so, I don't know, I grew up in an environment like that where even if you didn't get a command, you knew it was one.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. And I'm thinking, of course, there are a lot of workplaces where commanding is quite normal. Like my brother was in the Dutch army for a long time, and yeah, it's very normal just to say, do this, do that. Or, you know, in the kitchen, like if you're a chef, I think it's also quite normal just to command people, as far as I know. Yeah, in some workplaces that isn't normal. And I also, yeah, it would be interesting to see like how different people in different professions, like what kind of moral character these professions create, and if one is any worse than the other in terms of making people like competent moral agents.
Thank you.
Yeah, right. So that's norm enforcement bullshit. And then another one is commitment device bullshit. So sometimes I think that we can envision certain things for ourselves, and then we might say certain stuff to sort of like make a commitment device for ourselves to do something about it. Because if you say, I really care about the environment and I'm going to do my best to recycle, then you've said it now and you're on the hook. So you can be held accountable for what you said. And I read this one paper that was about ambition loops. So about when companies set very high ambitions, then it actually gives like policymakers and politicians the courage to say like, oh, okay, then, okay, we're going to do ambitious stuff as well, because all the biggest companies in the country are doing this. So seems like it's going to be all right if we also take an ambitious step right now. And then as a result, the companies are also going to feel more like, okay, maybe we can go even further. And I think there were a couple of examples in a paper from like sort of rainforest protection in like cocoa plantations and stuff like that.
I mean, I think this is very interesting, and I agree with that, greenwashing is on the one hand bad, but on the other hand, it is also creating a norm, it is creating expectation, it is creating a conversation, it is doing, you know, it's moving things forward. And so the question is, how effective is that really? I mean, what's the evidence for that? Is it the case that greenwashing is a stepping stone towards actual green action?
Yeah.
Or is it just hypocritical blabber that is delaying things? So do we know? Do you have any data?
Yeah. Okay. I have no data whatsoever, but I do have, there is a book by, I've forgotten the name, and I've forgotten to put the name on my slides. This is terrible. It starts with a B. A scholar who wrote about how back in the 80s, we used to have greenwashing, like very, very blatant greenwashing. Like you would have a Chevron advert, and they say, oh, look, we made some nice little holes where foxes can make nests on our oil plantation. Look, we care, and kind of like very blatant. And she argues that nowadays there's been a lot of backlash, and nowadays it's impossible. Like the level of greenwashing that was possible in the 80s is absolutely not possible nowadays. So what companies have stepped towards now is they don't do greenwashing anymore, but they do symbolic actions. So that means they will like actually start a program to plant some trees or something like that. Yes, Francis Bowen. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. See, I said it starts with a B. Yeah, I knew it.
Very good.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very nice book. And so of course the hope is like you said, like what if symbolic actions are a stepping stone to genuine improvements? It's maybe a very hopeful way to look at it, but if greenwashing is a stepping stone to symbolic actions, then yeah, maybe we're going in the right direction.
Yeah. Well, it wouldn't surprise me, actually, I think, because changing the conversation is really important. And then if the public picks up on the hypocrisy, I think that's acting as a corrective, right, to sticking to just greenwashing. And then, so I could see how that might work.
Yeah.
But it would be nice to have data on that.
It would be, yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so this is just a hope that I have. That would be great if that would be what happened. So that's commitment device BS, and of course that's also very close to virtue signaling BS. And I recently read a paper by Levy about how virtue signaling is actually very virtuous.
Is that the Levy from Macquarie?
Yeah. Oh, from Macquarie. Yeah. And so if you look at something like, you know, rainbow capitalism, like a lot of course, a lot of people are very, very annoyed by this, that all these big companies are like jumping on a bandwagon, like, oh, let's celebrate Pride and stuff like that. Even though they're not really necessarily doing that much to advance, like, you know, gay rights or queer rights. But it can really seem like they're just kind of trying to market themselves. But at the same time, the fact that all of these big brands are putting rainbow flags on their logos for Pride Month also says that it is now the norm to do that. So it is the norm to have this kind of solidarity. And there's definitely also something to be said for it. And I think actually this is probably all I had to say for today. Yeah, these were my 3 things. I'm very curious what you think, and I'm going to get my notebook out so that I can write things down.
Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Thanks, that was great. Yeah, well, let's open the floor.
We have 6 minutes left, so Kostas.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the great talk and very interesting references. I was keeping notes all the time because many of these authors I don't really know. One short note, I think Wittgenstein changed his mind in the end, right? So he became much more in favor of bullshitting in his later years, if I'm not mistaken. So one thought that came to my mind was when you were mentioning the positive aspect of the potential positive aspect of bullshitting, it sounded a lot like the positive aspect of overconfidence, right? When we are discussing that when you are overconfident, you're much more likely to engage with an activity that if you were aware of your actual abilities, you wouldn't, in a way, right? So it's kind of like transferring this to the second level of interaction. So not about yourself, but about others in the same sense. And the second point I had to make was in regards to the first part, when you were discussing, so why do we bullshit, right? Why would someone promise to try to not cheat on his girlfriend or something like this? So in a way, isn't this a way to avoid having more uncomfortable discussions that go to the root of the problem? Or maybe postpone the discussion to a later time when you will be able to say, oh, actually, there's nothing I can do now.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, really good points. First of all, do you happen to have a reference on the overconfidence? I mean, I'm sure there's probably a lot of studies, but if anybody should have a good reference for me, because I'm definitely going to get this question again, so it would be good to look something up.
Yeah.
And secondly, yeah, I do think that the promising to try, it can indeed be like a conversation extender, conversation sort of prolonger. And I think this is exactly the sense in which it is bullshit, because it is masquerading as a promise, but it is actually just I don't really know, I just want to say something and I can't be bothered to really think about it right now. So I think that's exactly the purpose of it. Like bullshit can have a purpose, and that's exactly why I think bullshit is useful sometimes, because it's sometimes good to extend the conversation for a little longer.
Yeah, totally. And to this point, just one more note. In regard to how it works with the other person, it's our tendency to interpret things the way we want it, right? So when Shell gives this promise to try, if we really want to believe that Shell will do something, we interpret it as an actual promise that they will try, while they're saying, "Come on, they know we don't mean it," or each agent can interpret what was said the way they want it, and they can interpret the way that you interpret it the way they want it. I don't know if I was too complex here and the way I said it. Sorry.
Okay, so you mean that there is a kind of like, there's many different ways in which you can interpret a bullshit promise. One of those ways might be like, oh, this is a polite deflection.
Yeah.
Or yes, this is indeed a promise, or this is a bullshit promise. Like there's a range, yeah, in which you can interpret it. Yeah, and I think that's actually also, I think you're right. And I think that's also what makes bullshit so powerful sometimes, is because it is multiply interpretable and kind of vague. And you can't really be on the hook for anything that you bullshit.
I think Alan was next.
Yes. Alan.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. I was really interested in the proposal of a different type of insouciance, so the contrast between, or the comparison between epistemic insouciance and trust insouciance. But I was maybe a little less sure about connecting the trust insouciance to the Searle conditions for promising, partly because I'm a little worried independently about those as being good conditions for a promise, but it kind of raised quite a few questions. I'll just ask one, of course, and it's just a clarificatory question really, but in the case of epistemic insouciance, the thing that you don't care about is value, epistemic value, truth, and it's kind of compatible with your insouciance that what you're saying actually is true. It's just that you don't care one way or the other. It could be true or it could not be as far as you're concerned. But then for the trust insouciance, I wasn't sure whether you were happy with the possibility that, so I don't care on your account. I don't care about whether I'm meeting the conditions for a promise. On your account, would it be possible for me to have trust insouciance, but somehow actually be meeting the conditions? So I don't care about whether I'm able to perform the action. But as a matter of fact, I can. And I don't care about whether I intend to do it or not. I actually do intend to do it anyway. So I did wonder if in the same way that for the epistemic case, it's compatible with insouciance, that it is true, as much. It turns out that it is true. On your account, is it possible for trust insouciance to be compatible with, you somehow actually have met the conditions that you set for a promise?
Okay, so you're asking what, so it is possible to bullshit in a very epistemically insouciant way and have that bullshit be true anyway.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, and so you're asking, is it possible to be very trust insouciant and have that promise be valid anyway?
Yeah, because somehow you've, as a matter of, even you don't, so in your condition, it's that you don't care about whether you've met the conditions for promising.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether, in addition to that, you also want to say, and as a matter of fact, you don't meet those conditions, or is it literally just you don't care whether you meet them or not, and that might be compatible with meeting them?
Yeah, right. So I think I would say that you just, it's enough to be like, it is possible to make a bullshit promise and to carry it out in the end. So I can imagine that Shell might bullshit about becoming really sustainable. And then like in 2 years, they get some new CEO and this CEO is completely super sustainability minded and turns everything around. But that it will still have been a bullshit promise at the time. So that is more like a matter of like moral luck, I think, in a case like that. So I would say that it is possible. Can I ask you about the you said you weren't sure about whether you weren't sure about the Searle conditions. Is that because you're unsure about whether Searle's conditions describe commissives properly anyway, or just curious?
Oh, I thought, well, for what it's worth, I think they're overly restrictive if what they're trying to do is determine whether I've actually promised or not. Because I feel like there are quite a lot of plausible counterexamples to that, unless if the definition is just meant to be stipulative and not meet our intuitions, then fine, that's the thing that we can do too. But as a general rule, it seems overly restrictive, and but I'll stop talking there because I've talked too much.
Okay, no, yeah, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, good to know. And yeah, maybe the point about whether a threat is also a promise. That's like one of these things where the conditions are maybe also a bit restrictive.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so we are a few minutes past the hour. Thank you very much, Alan. So look, I'm sorry, I think I have to stop you, but, but thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Mandi, for joining us today.
Yeah.
So I'll
Thank
stop
you.
Thank you, everyone. So I'll stop recording now.